Good evening. I'm Nicole Yanieri, Director of the ECU Language Academy, housed within the Office of Global Affairs at East Carolina University. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's presentation entitled The Long Civil Rights Movement from Emmett Till to Black Lives Matter. As someone with nearly 20 years experience in international education, I first conceptualized this project as a way to introduce international students to the history of American racism and why it persists to this day. However, international students are not the only ones who stand to benefit from this knowledge. Many of us, including those of us born and raised in the United States, remain ignorant of the important truths that have become obfuscated by the fabrications that white privilege has wrought over the course of hundreds of years. Some useful information before we begin tonight's program. As a reminder, participants should use the Ask a Question feature for anything directed toward our panelists, while the chat function can be used for any other information or for clarification requests. This may be especially useful to those in the audience from the international community, including multilingual speakers of English who may require further clarification of culturally specific or otherwise unfamiliar terms. Special thanks are due to East Carolina University's Office of Equity and Diversity, Office of Global Affairs, and the Ladonia Wright Cultural Center, as well as to UNC Chapel Hill's Carolina Public Humanities and Carolina K-12, without whose support tonight's program would not have been possible. Sincere thanks are also extended to our gifted panelist, Sunny Kelly, as well as to all of you in attendance. Let us now, in the spirit of inquiry, open-mindedness, and humility, direct our attention to tonight's program. I now turn the camera to Joanna Sirk-Smith, Associate Director for State Outreach and Community College Collaborations with Carolina Public Humanities, who will serve as tonight's moderator. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for that introduction. And thank you to all of our partners at ECU for joining us in this collaboration, as well as our generous supporters at the North Carolina Museum of History and the North Caroliniana Society. And we're very pleased that this virtual format allows us to share such an important conversation with so many educators, students, and interested members of the public around North Carolina and beyond. Our wonderful colleague, Paul Benici, will be active behind the scenes tonight. So if you have any technical problems, just drop him a note in the chat and he will be able to help you troubleshoot. And to all you educators out there, Christy Norris of Carolina K-12 will also be there in the chat box to offer resources and to answer questions alongside Nicole Ianieri. Now, many of us here tonight probably grew up hearing the civil rights movement framed by textbooks and by our teachers as something that happened in the 50s and 60s. Yet, as we've seen so vividly in just this past year, the civil rights movement is far from over, and it was far from new in the 1950s. Our program tonight will examine the deep history of the long civil rights movement, tracing fights for equality that began before our nation's founding, that were carried forward by generation after generation of resistance and protest, and that continue to this day. We'll take a tour through time from Crispus Attucks to Emmett Till to Ahmaud Arbery to consider how Black lives have always mattered, but mattered to different people in different ways and for different reasons. We're thrilled to have Dr. Sunny Kelly here with us to lead us through this history. Dr. Kelly holds a PhD in Communication and Performance Studies from UNC Chapel Hill, where his research focused on developing trauma-informed performance-based interventions to empower underserved youth to counter the school-to-prison pipeline. As you'll see this evening, Dr. Kelly is a world-class performer, storyteller, motivator, speaker, and comedian. He's also a writer and director of live theater, as well as the creator and co-host of the crossover radio show in Fayetteville. As a professional storyteller, he has performed for the National Association of Black Storytellers, the Black Storytellers Alliance, as well as countless schools, businesses, and civic organizations around the country. And he is a huge proponent of bringing the arts into schools in order to help teachers grapple with hard history, to empower students to reclaim and reframe their shared histories, and to pave the way towards a more equitable and inclusive future. I saw in the registration notes that many of you here with us tonight have seen Dr. Kelly. Either have you seen him perform his amazing one-man play, The Talk, or you've seen him speak as a part of other Carolina K-12 events. And I am not surprised that you are coming back for more. Tonight, Dr. Kelly will be interweaving excerpts from his play, The Talk, as well as from the newly completed Haunted, as he highlights various points in the long and ongoing struggle for civil rights that deserve our attention. And I want to invite you to share any questions that you have for Dr. Kelly in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as they occur to you. And we'll work through as many of those questions as possible in a discussion with Dr. Kelly at the end of our program this evening. So with that, let me hand over the virtual stage to Dr. Sunny Kelly. Sunny, thank you so much for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Christy. Thank you, Paul, UNC, ECU, all of my family that's here tonight. I am glad and honored. I thank my creator and my ancestors that I can be here tonight, that I can share with you all what I always like to say is my story, which after I've done research becomes our story, and after I share it with you, evermore becomes our growing and expanding story. I don't complain. I don't claim to have done all the research. I don't claim to know all of the solutions. But I do want to present to you all what I've learned, what I'm learning, and how we can learn each other better. I think it was Clementa C. Pinckney, the late Clementa C. Pinckney, who said that around the South we have a deep appreciation for history. We don't always have a deep appreciation for each other's history. So let us find ways to bind that together. So I present to you some excerpts from The Talk and from Haunted, and I hope you enjoy. Nearly 100 years ago, a poet, a great American poet, a great American black poet, if we must, named Langston Hughes, wrote a poem called I Too. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes. But I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes, and nobody will dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Oh no. Why did he do that, Daddy? I don't know, son. I think maybe he was angry or sad. Why is he so angry or sad? I don't know. Maybe he has like mental illness, like he's sick in his head. And the people in that church, they're different than him. But they're not different than him, Daddy. They're people and he's people. No, son. He's white, and all the people in that church, they were black. It's Wednesday, June 17th, 2015, at the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston called Emmanuel, or Mother Emmanuel. Now, for centuries, Mother Emmanuel has been known to people in Charleston and beyond as a bastion for the black community. It has been a place where abolitionists and captives, where civil rights leaders and volunteers have met to plan runaways, revolts, rallies, revivals. In fact, back in 1822, that summer, there was a slave revolt that was so big that it made the white people around Charleston so afraid they burned down Mother Emmanuel to the ground. Well, tonight is not one of those nights. It is a typical night of Bible study. And the pastor, who happens to be a state senator, Clementa C. Pinckney, is leading his congregation in a typical night of Bible study. Now, on this night, there are 11 members of Mother Emmanuel present and one unexpected visitor. The 11 members are all black, and the unexpected visitor is a 21-year-old white supremacist named Dylan Storm Roof. Now, the name Dylan is Welsh. It means son of the sea or son of the wave. So as Mother Emmanuel's members bow their heads in solemn prayer, Dylan raises his. This angry son of the South rises up in this seaside church house with a .45 caliber pistol in hand and rains down a storm of bullets on the people in front of him. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Cynthia Marie Graham Hurd, Susie J. Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Clementa Carlos Pinckney, Daryl Lee Simmons, Myra Thompson. But why did he do that, Daddy? They were just praying. He didn't have to be afraid of people who are just praying. I know, son. I know, but well, sometimes in this world, people just hate people, and so you got to be careful, okay? But why? But why what? But why do we have to be careful? Because you do, okay? Because you do, and because I said so. I knew why. I knew exactly why. It was because of blackness. There, I said it. It was because of blackness, or what we've made of blackness. Blackness is a thing of no real substance, yet it weighs upon my existence in the most precarious of ways. It is laden with stigma. Some say it's just a figment of imagination these days. Some days I'd like to believe them, erase it all and relieve them of the guilt and the shame and the sorrow and the pain, but blackness is not going anywhere. My blackness is always right there. With me, without me, around me, about me. It rests upon my shoulders, pressed down from the ancestors, a mantle so dark, yet lighter than air. At times I lose sight of it and forget that it's there. But I can always feel it. It reframes my anger as bestial rage. It reclaims my protest as riots on the newspaper page. It looms with expectations that color my core. It rises like a specter when I enter a store, or when I wear a hoodie on the street, or when I forget my receipt, or when I fail to keep a smile on my face, when I'm in an uncomfortable place where I'm the only one not seen as a native son. When I forget to pay a debt, or that my body is a threat to some and a target to others. Before Dylan Roof opened fire on him, 26-year-old Tywanza Sanders asked Dylan, "Why are you doing this?" "I have to do this. You rape our women, and you're taking over our country, and you have to go." Now, the strange thing is, I don't entirely blame Dylan for this. No, I don't blame Dylan. I don't blame his mental illness. I don't blame the dark web. No, I blame the ghost of blackness that haunted him. It haunts me too. It haunts the way I walk and the way I talk. It haunts my conversations with my kids. If we're honest, it haunts us all in one way or another. Tuesday, November 22nd, 1898. A Negro rapist and a Negro seducer hanged. It is a fact not generally known that there have been 2 lynchings in North Carolina within the past 2 weeks. The first one was in Chapel Hill, Manly McCauley, on Friday night, October 28th. And on Wednesday afternoon, on October 26th, Miss Maggie Brewer, the wife of Milton Brewer, a prosperous farmer here in Orange County, eloped from the home of her husband with Manly McCauley, a young Negro, 18 years old. On Friday, a posse of 18 men, headed by the husband of the woman, set out in pursuit. The Negro and the woman were overtaken beyond Jonesboro. The Negro was taken part of the distance back to Chapel Hill, but disappeared. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote The Souls of Black Folk, and in it he reflects upon the experiences of many black people in this country at the turn of that century. One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro. 2 souls, 2 thoughts, 2 unreconciled strivings, 2 warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. X marks the spot. Good evening, family. Tonight, it is my duty, my burden in some ways, to share with you, dear ones, a terrifically tragic tale. This is a tale of souls haunted by forbidden love, betrayal, hatred, and cold-blooded murder. And I must warn you, this is not one of those typical ghoulish ghost stories told to strike fear in the hearts of children by firelight. No, 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 no. What you are about to hear is true. The names have not been changed in order to protect the innocent. The story you are about to hear is a story that is all too familiar to many of us here in this room tonight. No, 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 no. My friends, my family, my foes, this story is real. I must warn you, it is not for the faint of heart. It's kind of like a glass of dark liquor. It is aged, aromatic, unassuming, but rest assured, it will bite you. In some ways, it is stranger than fiction, and yet it is all too strangely familiar to us here in this space tonight. Let me take you back in history to a time that none of us in this room remembers. It is a time that ended right here, at this dogwood tree. Can you see it? X marks the spot. At this fateful juncture, a handsome, strapping young American, just 18 years old, was confronted with the jarring juxtaposition of his manhood and his blackness, surrounded by a group of his countrymen who were determined to destroy both. But this story is not just Manly Macaulay's story. This story is our story. And to get to the root of the matter, we've got to go back to our family tree. Yeah, yours and mine. Yes, this family tree holds our history, and it's been here for as long as any of us can remember, and it will be here for as long as, well, as long as we can imagine, I suppose. And it is indeed our family tree. But I must warn you, it is a haunted tree. It's full of saints and haints, is's and ain'ts, specters and spooks and inconvenient truths, constitutionalists and Confederates, captives and captors, euphemistically euthanized natives and Irish scrappers. They're all right here with you and me, coursing through our veins. Can you feel them? It's like that great American poet Paul Laurence Dunbar said, "They have shared your nightly vigils, they have shared your daily toil, and their blood with yours commingling has enriched the southern soil. Can you feel them?" I can feel them coursing through my natural-born veins, just running and running so fast and so hard. Sometimes I feel like my blood could boil sometimes. Can you feel them? Well, to tell this story tonight, I brought along my ancestors, some of our ancestors, my white grandpaps who stood up against British tyranny and northern aggression, who publicly poured tea in the sea and privately forced their bodily affection on my black and native grandmams. My black grands who survived the Middle Passage, whose dignity and wisdom defied the countless lashes. My Native American grands who honored the land and the gift of life until unexpected guests changed the plan with theft and strife. My African, European, and indigenous American ancestors who were killing, oppressing, and enslaving one another long before their paths ever collided with each other. I am the embodiment of our forefathers' commitment to these self-evident truths, that all men are created equal, although they didn't mean all men or any women before the amended sequels. Once alienated from my own unalienable rights, here I stand, a product of our ancestors' struggles and plights, from indentured servitude to the expanding frontier, from chattel slavery to the Trail of Tears. You see, they live in me. It's like Sister Maya Angelou raved, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. We are, Yah. We are the dream and the hope of our ancestors, yours and mine. Yeah, ours. See, before all of the division and derision, all of us, every one of us, came from mutual ancestors somewhere far east of here, in or near what we currently call Africa. So as strange as it may sound, and as hard as it may be to see, every one of us here is just an apple fallen from the same family tree. The same haunted tree. It just so happens that some of us, like Manly Macaulay and me, happen to be of a slightly darker hue than others. In the words of the great William Shakespeare, there's the rub. Tuesday, November 8th, 1898. The Negro is dead. That a white woman would stoop so low as to elope with a Negro seems impossible. But the woman was born of a family who winked at social equality and thought that the day when the white man and the Negro would be socially equal was not far distant. She married a man who entertained the same views, and they lived happily together. But one day, the man came home to find his wife had eloped with his Negro farmhand. They found him, Manly Macaulay, that they found him hanging from a dogwood tree. Historians have placed this particular dogwood tree at the modern-day intersection of Old Greensboro Road and Hatch Road in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We can only imagine what his last words were. Did he apologize? Mr. Brewer, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to come to this. Did he beg, please? Please, Mr. Brewer, I don't want to die, so please let me live. Maybe he stood strong, and faced down the powers that be. Maybe he stood strong and spoke those words that Claude McKay said in that great poem, If We Must Die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and pinned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making a curse of our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die. Like men we will face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. We can only imagine. What we do know is that Manly Macaulay was lynched on or around October 28, 1898 in Chapel Hill. What many Americans don't know is that lynching has some very complicated roots in American history. Merriam-Webster defines lynching as a verb, to put to death by mob action without legal approval or permission. Now, what many folks forget is that early American history was insanely violent by today's standards. Matter of fact, lynching in America at one time had nothing to do with race. It was entirely about the violence of it all. At one point, there were more white folks lynching white folks than anything else. Lynching actually can be traced back, by most historians, to the Revolutionary era. In the 1700s, when Tories or British sympathizers were often tortured and beaten and attacked with mob violence from colonists who wanted to be independent from Mother Britain. In fact, Charles Lynch was a famous Revolution-era justice of the peace who would persecute British sympathizers by having them beaten, tarred and feathered, even hung from trees. And don't get me started on the Salem witch trials or the Wild West. I mean, for a while there, it seemed like white folks were lynching white folks for general principle. But in the 1860s, when black people were finally seen as humans and free, white people got scared. And in that time frame, the noose of lynching placed itself around the neck of blackness. See, as law and order blossomed in the land, blackness rose to the occasion when our violent roots still thirsted for blood. See, while new laws promised human rights and civil rights to white people, like speedy trials and juries of their peers and innocence until proven guilty, blacks and non-whites were afforded no such luxury. Gradually, the number of white people being lynched decreased as the number of black people being lynched increased dramatically from the 1860s all the way on through to modern day. Lynching became an expected end for any black person who was deemed too uppity in the face of white authority, too persnickety in the face of white generosity, or too flirty in the presence of white femininity. Let's take, for example, Wright Woods, a young man who lived in Little River, North Carolina. On Sunday, September 12, 1869, it is said that Wright Woods made some untoward remarks to a white girl in his community. Before the sun could set, 4 white men on horses came and pulled that boy out of a kiln where he was working with his father. Wright Woods went missing for nearly a week before one of his neighbors noticed a gathering of vultures in a field. They found him there, dead, with a note attached to his foot saying, "If the law will not protect virtue, the rope will." Then there was Cyrus Guy. Sunday, December 13th, 1869. A Negro named Cyrus Guy was found near the Alamance line this week, hanging to a tree, dead. To his person was attached a paper written, "For insulting white ladies." That note on Cyrus Guy was written in his own blood. Blackness has indeed haunted us all in different ways. For a while there, white communities were so haunted by the fear of blackness that they would see lynching a black person as innocent and common day as a community watch patrol meeting or a block party, or both, all in one. Claude McKay described it like this: "Day dawned, and the mixed crowds came to view, the ghastly body swaying in the sun. The women thronged to look, but never a one showed sorrow in her eyes of steely blue. Little lads, lynchers that were to be, danced round the dreadful thing in fiendish glee." Like I said, blackness has truly haunted us all in different ways. Like when you put blackness over a concept or a term, it changes things, right? When you put blackness over law and order, then mob violence suddenly becomes okay to some people. When you put blackness over peaceful protests, suddenly people turn that into an instant riot or disrespect. When you put blackness onto a freedom fighter, he becomes a rioter, a rebel. Well, let's rewind a little bit and we'll fast forward. We're jumping around in some different places here, but I want to make sure we get to the root of what blackness has come to mean in America. If we want to really get to the root, we've got to go back to the 15th century and the explorers and colonization. But let's just look at America specifically and consider that famous year 1619. If you're a teacher in the room, you might have cringed. You might have gotten excited. I don't know. It's a point of great contention nowadays in curriculum development. 1619. It was the year that we have the first indication of Africans brought to the American colonies. There was a private ship from England called the White Lion, and it set sail and it dropped its anchor in the Jamestown River in the port of Comfort near the Jamestown colony in Virginia. After it dropped its anchor, the inhabitants of the ship got off, and on the record and on the manifest of that ship, there were recorded 20 and odd Africans. Now, we don't know much about these Africans, but we do know that some, if not all of them, were considered indentured servants at the time, not yet chattel slavery. This thing changes in 1640. So we're going to fast forward from 1619, the arrival of the first 20 and odd Africans in the American colonies, and we're going to go forward to 1640. In this time, a man named John Punch, an African indentured servant, decides that he's going to gather a couple of his friends together, a Dutchman named Victor and a Scotsman named James Gregory. And they're going to run away from their cruel master, Hugh Gwynn, in Virginia. So these 3 men come together in a sort of rainbow coalition in their pursuit of collective freedom. They run off with this foolproof plan into the woods, and they end up making it as far as Maryland before Hugh Gwynn captures them and brings them back. Now, what happens next is historical. He brings them back to the colonial court of Virginia, and the court decrees that all 3 men will be whipped for running away. that all three men will have an extension of their indentures. In other words, they have to serve more time as servants. The two European men are given a few more years of service. But when they look at John Punch, they say, and for the third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigns for the time of his natural life, here or elsewhere. This is the first statutory evidence of lifelong, or what we now call chattel slavery in America. Shortly after that, through the late 1600s into the 1700s, colonial governments started enacting laws and protocols that would reward poor whites and even indentured servant white people for capturing, reporting on, or even killing blacks and Native Americans. So the powers that be, they drove a wedge so deep between poor frontiersmen and indentured servants, blacks and Native Americans, that they were all so afraid of each other that there'd be no hope of them colluding again. Then there was the one-drop rule. They adopted this one-drop rule that said anyone that has a provable drop of African blood in their body can actually be enslaved. This meant that blackness now became a marker not only for cheap labor, but free labor from birth. And so from these early years, mostly because of economic interest and because of the simplicity of being able to mark someone as black by their features, blackness became a marker in this country. So let me fast forward now to 1992. I'm going to date myself here. I'm 16 years old, and I am in high school in Santa Ana, California. And I am at Saddleback High School in my junior year taking AP US History with one of my favorite teachers of all time, Mr. Rohn, because the man was a great storyteller. I used to love to listen to him speak. And I remember one day in class, he stands up and has this very interesting, mischievous look on his face. He looks across the room and he asks a question that no one in the room knows the answer to. Who here knows the first person to die in the American Revolution? Now, I have no idea, so I'm just quiet. But like some of my other colleagues think they know. So they're like, Samuel Adams. No. Paul Revere. No. Patrick Swayze. Patrick Henry. No. They were all wrong. In just a quick moment, Mr. Rohn peeks over to me and gives me this knowing wink. And he announces, Crispus Attucks, Monday, March 5th, 1770. The Boston Massacre. So we're all flipping through our books, and I get to the page about the Boston Massacre. And there I see the names of 5 martyrs, 5 great young patriots who gave their lives for their country. Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, Patrick Carr, and a mulatto man named Crispus Attucks. A man who looked more like me than any other black person I'd ever seen in my studies of colonial history of America. My chest swelled. I felt this great sense of pride. I mean, this was a bonus. It wasn't even close to Black History Month, right? And to this day, I'm so grateful to Mr. Rohn, who happened to be a middle-aged conservative white male. I'm so grateful to him for bringing this piece of empowering and triumphant history to my knowledge. Now, one thing I learned about the picture that I'd seen of Crispus Attucks in that book was that it was a drawing done by William Champney in 1855. And in this drawing, you see this very prominent, dark, black man fighting against the soldiers in the foreground. He's the main focal point of the picture. But I came to learn that the reason why William Champney did that, made Crispus Attucks such a prominent element of that painting or that drawing, was because of the fact that he was using it to dignify black people during the abolitionist movement of that time in 1855. Well, then, when I did a little more research, I realized and learned that the very first depiction of the Boston Massacre was produced by none other than Paul Revere. It was a lithograph that showed a sea of white people dying and shooting at each other, but you cannot find a brown-skinned person or a curly-haired person anywhere in there. If you can, they're hidden. And I realized, wow, blackness really does matter. It mattered enough to William Champney to make Crispus Attucks' blackness just defiant in his drawing. And it mattered enough to Paul Revere to erase Crispus Attucks' blackness in his original lithograph from 1770. And And I'll tell you, 200 years later, to a black kid who'd never seen his ancestors depicted as anything but slaves and servants in colonial America, it mattered to me. Now, before we get caught up in the nostalgia and selective amnesia of American history, let us just rewind a little bit and look at Crispus Attucks' story. Now, if we go back to that crisp night in Boston in 1770, we see a man who's fighting for his beliefs. But if you go back to 1723, when Crispus Attucks was born, you see that he was born to a woman of the Wampanoag tribe, a Native American woman up in the Massachusetts area, and a black servant or slave captive in the Framingham area of Massachusetts. We also know that about 1750 or so, Crispus was a runaway slave. See, there was an ad put in a Boston newspaper by a man named William Brown that indicates that Crispus Attucks was approximately 6 feet 2 inches tall, knock-kneed, and had curly hair. Incidentally, the name Crispus means curly. So Crispus Attucks was another runaway slave. How did he not get caught? He became a sailor. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of black runaway slaves in New England and north of the Mason-Dixon line would get into sailing because that would protect them from slave catchers and allow them to travel across the world and see things and not be so judged for their blackness. Well, sailing was a tough life, but Crispus Attucks was tough. He was strong and he endured it. He also became a rope maker. The word on the street is that he had just come back from the Bahamas and was on his way to North Carolina on a whaling ship when he got caught up in the fray of what happened in Boston that night of March 5th, 1770. Well, we know a few things about what happened that night. There were many different reports. Some of them coalesce, some of them collide. But what we do know is that the Americans hated the British soldiers for many reasons. Two of the main reasons, though, were that the British soldiers would work for less. So they would take jobs from the American colonists by undercutting them. The second one is that the British soldiers would oftentimes find a healthy, strong, young American colonist, kidnap him, and enlist him into the British Navy. And it was their legal right to do so. So these notions of foreigners coming to our country and stealing our jobs and partaking in human trafficking, they're not new. So we know that these colonists who were shouting and yelling at these soldiers on this night, there were about 300 to 500 of them, and 8 soldiers at a particular sentry box. We know that these people were very angry. They were throwing everything from clam shells and oyster shells to snowballs. They shouted, "You lobsters, bloody backs, fire, why don't you?" We know at this time that Crispus Attucks at some point was at the front with this big stick and he was yelling, kill them, knock them over, kill the dogs." And then Captain Thomas Preston, the captain of the guard, he tried to calm things down. Order, order, stand off. I presume no one desires to die this night. Well, before we know it, somebody from the crowd throws a stick or a club. It hits Private Montgomery. He goes down to the ground. Somebody else yells, "Damn you, fire!" Crispus Attucks in all this fray grabs onto a musket by the bayonet. He proceeds to beat the soldier when a hot musket ball lands in his chest. When the smoke cleared, there were several musket balls shot in indiscriminate fire, and there were 5 dead or dying colonists lying in the bloody snow. Now, at this time, some people would say that was a riot, but the Bostonians saw that as a first step of the revolution. In fact, Crispus Attucks' body lay in state in Boston's Faneuil Hall for 3 days. The famous patriot Samuel Adams actually sponsored a lavish funeral for him. They say that thousands of people followed Crispus and the other martyrs' caskets through the streets, chanting and marching and shouting in demonstration. Now, all this changed, though, at the defense hearing for the soldiers. They were defended by none other than the great lawyer John Adams, who would become our second president. And this was the crux of his defense of these 8 soldiers. Attucks, with his myrmidons, comes round Jackson's Corner and down to the sentry box. Now, the soldiers push the people back, and this man, with his party, shouts, kill them, knock them over, and proceeds to try to beat their brains out. It is plain that the soldiers did not leave their station. Now, to have a reinforcement like this coming down under the command of a stout mulatto fellow whose very looks was enough to terrify any person, what had not then the soldiers to fear? Attucks, like the colonial court back in Virginia, had learned this very American skill of weaponizing blackness for political and economic gain. After deliberating for a couple of hours, all of the soldiers were found not guilty. Then came that great day of Thursday, July 4th, 1776, when, in the throes of a Revolutionary War, the 13 bold and courageous colonies drafted a Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was the beginning of the American ideal. This is where it was born. This ideal of freedom and liberty for all. It was a stark contrast to the daily lives of those black captives who lived on the plantations and in the homes of our very forefathers who wrote those words. But this lust for liberty, it is infectious and it is insatiable and indomitable. It inspired enslaved men like Denmark Vesey, one of the founders of Mother Emanuel, and that plantation preacher turned rabble-rouser, Nat Turner. Many of us have probably heard of him. He was in Southampton, Virginia, just causing all kinds of ruckus with slave revolts and runaways. Well, it inspired them, the Declaration of Independence, and they were fueled by this fierce commitment to their faith, this fascination with these words of the Declaration of Independence. And they were fired up by Toussaint Louverture. He led a revolt of captive men and women against the French in Haiti in 1791. By 1804, the Haitian government was the first and only government run in the Western Hemisphere by former captives, black people. The Western world didn't know what to do with that. By the mid-1800s, there were at least 250 slave revolts or rebellions in America. These rebellions struck fear in the hearts of white people, but hope in the hearts of black captives. See, every rebellion was a riot, a revolt to white people, but every rebellion was a potential revolution to black people. After Denmark Vesey was convicted of inciting insurrection in 1822, he, like all of the other leaders of all of the other 250 plus rebellions, was killed. Shortly thereafter, the original Mother Emanuel Church was burned to the ground. All of this within days of America's Independence Day. Exactly 30 years after this, the great abolitionist and activist Frederick Douglass was asked what he thought about the 4th of July. He, in turn, answered a proud nation with a question of his own. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is constant victim. I say this with sad sense of the difference between us. I am not included within the pale of glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. So we'll fast forward. Of course, we had a Civil War, we had Jim Crow, and we'll talk about that a little bit more tonight. But I want to go back to Manly Macaulay's story and the fact that Manly Macaulay, being a black man who ran away with a white man's wife, became a political move. His blackness was leveraged. The Democrats at the time, who were the party of white supremacy, they used that story of Manly Macaulay and Maggie Brewer and Milton Brewer to sway the votes. They would say things like, Milton Brewer reaped what he sowed. Vote for the protection of your daughters and your wives. Vote for your race. They would publish ads and articles and write editorials that said these kind of things. The scandal of it blew sails into the blew wind into the sails of the Democrats, and they swept North Carolina elections that year in 1898 at the local, at the state, at the federal level. But there was one place, Wilmington, North Carolina, where Republicans and black people still held important, prominent positions in the government. Well, inspired by this sweeping, forceful wave of white supremacy across the nation, a man named Waddell, Alfred Moore Waddell, who was a Confederate veteran and a statesman, decided to stand up and lead a revolt against the government of Wilmington. We will not live under these intolerable conditions. No society can stand it. We intend to change it if we must choke the current of the Cape Fear River with black carcasses. Waddell led a group of angry white people to burn the black newspaper, to take over the government. He became the mayor. This was the first and only successful coup in American history. It was not corrected. To this day, Waddell and people of his ilk have buildings named after them across Wilmington and the state. They estimate that some 60 to 100 people were killed, but nobody knows. There was no record of it. And most of the prominent black people were either killed or run out of town. And 150 miles away, Manly Macaulay's body still dangled from that dogwood tree in Chapel Hill and hung up there for 10 days, almost like a sign to people, a warning. Just months later, James Weldon Johnson, the famous historian and poet, wrote a poem called Lift Every Voice. It would later become the Black National Anthem. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmony of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. It's not that black people wanted to have a separate or special national anthem. It's that when you live in a country that doesn't seem to want you, sometimes you got to find ways to encourage yourself. When you're surrounded by folks who seem hell-bent on breaking you down, you got to find a way to build yourself up. Remind yourself that your life does matter to somebody. In January of 1900, Ida B. Wells, the famous activist, anti-lynching advocate, and journalist, spoke to a crowd of Americans, and she called them to action. Our country's national crime is lynching. Our watchword has been the land of the free and the home of the brave. Brave men do not gather by thousands to torture and murder a single individual, so bound and gagged he cannot make feeble resistance or defense. Nor do brave men or women stand by and watch such things happen, nor read of them without protest. Surely it should be the nation's duty to correct its own evils. I too sing America. Manly Macaulay's death has only been reported, as the newspapers in the Chapel Hill area have said, because the Negroes threatened trouble if it wasn't. There were 4 men who were tried for Manly Macaulay's death. Milton Brewer, the husband of the woman, and 3 other men. One of them was a sheriff deputy. The only reason they went to trial was because of fear of the Negroes causing trouble. The trial was short. All men were acquitted. But that was a small victory for the black people in that community who just wanted the dignity of recognition that life was lost. A life was taken unlawfully by a mob, not a bunch of community watch patrollers. Consider George Zimmerman. Consider the story that we'll hear tonight of Gregory and Travis McMichael. I recall the story of Emmett Till. I share it in my piece, The Talk, as I talk about the talk that I have to have with my son and the talk I have with my sons on a regular basis as black boys in America. And I think about the talk that Emmett Till's mother had with him. Bo, now you listen here, Bo. Please put a handle on all those yeses and nos. Say yes, ma'am, and no, sir. That talk turned out to be their last. See, Emmett was just a loudmouth, funny 14-year-old kid from Chicago spending his first summer in Money, Mississippi. He encountered the wrong people. There were some untoward words or expected or suspected untoward words given to a white woman. And Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam assumed that Emmett had done something inappropriate to Roy's wife, Carolyn. Well, within a day, Roy and J.W. pulled Emmett out of his bed in front of his grown uncle, who could do nothing to help him because blackness was upon him. Blackness was a marker for weakness. Blackness was a marker for silence. Blackness was a marker for victim. And that little boy was beaten and murdered, and his body was tossed into the Tallahatchie River. And when his mother finally got a hold of his body, the stench from it being waterlogged and the days of the hot sun and stagnant water just inundating that body was disgusting. You couldn't recognize the child. He'd been beaten beyond recognition, and she insisted upon having an open casket funeral. Have you ever sent a loved son on vacation and had him return to you in a pine box, so horribly battered and waterlogged that someone needs to tell you that this sickening sight is your son lynched? Let the people see what I've seen. I think everybody needs to know what has happened to Emmett Till. It is strange how blackness has channeled and forced different shows of resistance and protest in my people. That what Mamie did was not only a great act of courage, but that was an act of activism. And so we've had to find creative ways to speak up and to speak out. Now today, you know, if you see a noose hanging from a garage door or somebody's house or a tree, we all know to be offended, right? We all know that's racism. That's a hate crime. But there's security in offense, right? As our stomachs churn with righteous indignation, there is safety in that. There's certainty in that. But the spirit of blackness, it's a sneaky spirit. It's shape-shifty. It is a marker for poverty and violence and crime and frantic 911 calls and stand your ground gun laws. It conforms to the contours of our conscience. So I want to take you quickly to the story of Ahmaud Arbery, and I will just briefly catch you up on what happened there. On Sunday, February 23rd, in the year 2020, 25-year-old black man is jogging through a neighborhood not far from his home in a place called Brunswick, Georgia. The neighborhood is called Santilla Shores. Now, Ahmad is jogging. Two white men notice Ahmad. He takes an unauthorized foray into a construction site, and he continues to jog from there. They notice him, and they see his blackness out of place. Now, Ahmad's name, incidentally, means high praise or worthy of praise. And the white men who see him, one is Gregory McMichael, 64 years old, an ex-police officer, and his son is Travis McMichael. Now, Gregory is Latin Gregorius, which means alert or aware. And then Travis is Old English. It means crossroads or toll gate. So on this particular road, on this day, in this neighborhood, Gregory's alert eye catches Ahmad's blackness out of place. Travis will soon demand of Ahmad a hefty toll that he cannot pay. The two men call the police. They try to chase Ahmad down. Ahmad runs harder, runs faster, like John Punch running for his freedom, but they won't stop chasing him down. They're in a vehicle. Gregory has a .357 Magnum pistol, and Travis has a shotgun. They jump out of the vehicle. Travis does. Gregory stays in the vehicle. And Travis attempts to make a citizen's arrest against this unarmed black man going for a Sunday jog. And I guess Ahmad became defiant. He realized his back was against the wall and he would not go out quietly. He fought like Crispus Attucks fought against that soldier back in Massachusetts. And he lost. He was shot once in the hand and twice in the chest. His body lay there on the ground. And Gregory and Travis went home that night and slept in their beds, enjoyed a typical Sunday night. They were not arrested for nearly 2 months. On May 7th, they were arrested because, to excuse my French, the fear of what the Negroes would do, the fear of the trouble the Negroes could bring. Once Ahmad's death, which was caught on a phone, was publicized, it was published and broadcast on local TV networks and national and international TV networks, on every social media platform. And we saw that picture of this young man dying in our eyes day after day. It was suspended in our imaginary and wrapped in repeat. Like Manly Macaulay's body was suspended from the branch of that dogwood tree, his neck wrapped in rope for days and days. Later, Ahmad's images would collapse and coalesce and collide with images of the now infamous curbside execution of George Floyd on Monday, May 25th, 2020, under the knee of Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Both of these men had become famous now, kind of like Crispus Attucks' name is famous. They're celebrated by their communities and lifted up in the Black Lives Matter movement. Say their name. But some people aren't so comfortable with that. Some people would prefer to look at their pedigrees and their criminal records and try to find some excuse, some reason to indicate that these men were actually threats to the law and order of the land, and mob violence and lynching was justified for them. Then there are those who would prefer to believe that Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd were flukes, anomalies, just rare cases of a good system gone wrong, and explain it away. My concern is that as Americans, all of us understand that foreign occupation of our soil is tyranny. It is a threat to our national existence, but only some of us understand that racism is tyranny, a threat to our spiritual and bodily existence. What happened to Ahmaud Arbery, it wasn't Boston in 1770. It wasn't colonial Virginia in 1640. It wasn't even Chapel Hill in 1898. It was Georgia in 2020. Let us contend with this foe of racism together. Let us protest. Let us stand strong. Let us cause, as the great late John Lewis would say, good trouble. Thank you all for hanging out with me and sharing. We have a few minutes for questions. I would love to entertain them and to discuss more with you.
Dr. Kelly, thank you so much for all of that. You have already given us so much to think about, and we've got a ton of questions coming in here.
Okay, you're very welcome.
You left us, on this big note. Racism is tyranny. This is such a powerful way of framing our country's deep legacy of racism and violence and oppression. And a question we've gotten already from a few different folks is about the denial of structural racism. Monica Brown at UNC Pembroke, for example, asks, how do we reach out to Americans who completely dismiss the idea that there is structural racism? And I would add to that, why does this historical fiction seem to have such a strong hold in America today?
There's a man named David Campt who's a PhD in psychology. He wrote a book called The White Allies Toolkit workbook, and I love that book because it helps me to understand how we can find ways to communicate the existence of systemic racism to people who deny it, or they say it's not that bad, right? As a communicator, I have found that if you're going to get into conflict, and anyone who believes that racism is not a problem in America today, I'm going to have conflict with them, right? Not mad at the person, but there's going to be conflict because we are diametrically opposed on this particular topic. So in dealing with conflict, you need to create a confirming communication climate. That is, I cannot convince you of anything. I cannot present my case in a way that you will digest it and hear it if I'm coming for you the whole time, if I'm calling you out the whole time and saying it's you, it's your ancestors, etc. That's why in the beginning, when I talk about our family tree and how it's haunted and how I'm also haunted, I do have white grandpaps. I have white grandparents who were Confederates from Virginia. And I have black grandparents who were captives. And I have native grandparents who were murdered and whose land. They're all within me. Right? I think it was, her name is Caroline Williams, wrote an editorial for the New York Times and said, I am the embodiment, right, of the Confederacy. You don't need your statues. I'm it. Here I am, right? So many of us are. And so I think it's so important to begin with a person who is what I would call race blind or aspirationally colorblind. Nobody in America is colorblind. You can't be. It's just how we operate. I know we want to be, and it's a great aspiration. Affirm that. But we're not colorblind, right? It's why when we see our Asian friends, we say, where are you from? And we don't mean Arkansas or Anaheim. We mean like what country? Because you're not from here. Because we see everything in color and race and ethnicity. It's part of the roots of where we come from. But first thing I want to do is affirm that person. I know they don't think racism is real. So what I want to do is just say, you know what? I love our Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to perform a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and promote the general welfare, do, ordain, and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. I love it. I fought for it. I'm a veteran. Yeah, and it's still racist, right? I'm still gonna come but what you can't do is come and say everything that we've ever done is racist in this country. Everything that our forefathers were all racist. They're all, When we do that, and sure, they were racist, and sure, we as Americans deal with racism, but they still had some redeeming values. Like they wrote a document that is the ideal that drove Nat Turner, that drove Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? I've heard somebody say this: don't blame Christ for the Christians, for example, right? The document itself is living; it can be amended. It's part of who we are. So what I first do when I'm dealing with a person that I don't think will acknowledge the extent to which racism is a problem is I first celebrate what we have in common. I love our nation. Now, you may have a different testimony. My testimony is it's been good to me. I'm a veteran. I'm a proud veteran. My wife's still in the military now. Don't agree with everything our military has done, but I'm very proud of much of what we've done, and we're doing the best we can. Just like my grandfather. He was a police officer. He was a great man. He was also an alcoholic. I got to have both of them. It is what it is, right? And so I think if we can kind of state what we love about our country and stand in solidarity, say, I'm a patriot too. I too sing America. And we got some issues we got to deal with. Can we talk it through? Now, once we've gotten that place where we have common ground, now let's talk about my lived experience. And I think the talk was a breakthrough for me. When I realized I was having talks with my sons that other people who don't look like me, especially white people, don't have, I realized, oh, we live in two different Americas in some ways. Sometimes it coalesces and it's the same America. We'll be at Orlando and Disneyland and we're good. And then when the law gets involved or when fear gets involved or this notion of blackness gets onto the table, then the tables turn and we don't all know why because we don't talk about it. Because we're so afraid to talk about it. You don't want to offend. I don't want to seem like the angry black person. You feel guilty. I feel bitter and upset because we never resolved this. And so we don't talk about it. And the less we talk about it, the more it can fester and confuse us. And like I say, blackness is a sticky spirit. It is sneaky. It's shape-shifty. It conforms to the contours of our conscience. And it makes us think that what we're doing is okay when we don't realize that we're doing and saying some of the same things that were said hundreds of years ago that dehumanized people, right? And so I think if we can get to that place where we first acknowledge what we have in common, celebrate the beauty of what America is and what it is to be a Southern person, how we call it soul food, but oftentimes soul food is really just Southern food, right? Those things we have in common. And then say, in my experience, I know your experience is, in my experience, it's been like this. This really hurt me. This really happened to my children. It happened to my family, right? Most of my black male friends have had some negative experiences with police and it wasn't their fault. Right? And then we go from there to say, okay, so can we start to expand and just stretch? And it's a process, not a product. Right? I've learned this. I can't just expect you to be woke all of a sudden. Kevin Kazi Thomas, he has a show called Intelligently Ratchet on Facebook. And he's also doing a radio show in the Triangle area. Amazing thinker and a wonderful guy and a leader. He told me one time after we did a show, The Talk, he said, everybody wants everybody to be woke. I want you to be woke. Everybody needs to be woke. Well, you don't wake somebody up by pouring a big bucket of ice water on them. Nobody wants to be awakened that way. What you will do is you will offend them. What you do is say, hey, good morning. Hey, I'm your friend. You know me? Okay, my feelings are really hurt. My body was really hurt. I feel threatened. In a way you don't feel threatened, it's okay. You don't have to feel guilty. No, don't make me comfort you. No, I just want to tell you that there's something I'm experiencing that you're not. If you could help me out with your privilege, because I don't think your privilege is a problem. I think it's an asset. I love your privilege. Matter of fact, if you can come stand next to me, I might get shot less or hurt less. Or, you know what I'm saying? Real talk. So, like, quit apologizing for it. I don't want anybody to apologize to me. I don't want when I say reparations, I don't want your emotional reparations for you. I'm so sorry for slavery. I get it. It was horrible. It was horrible. Yeah, but what are we going to do now to invest in a better future now? Let's do that. And when you let people off the hook in that way, it becomes generative. I don't need you to feel bad about this thing. I know some people feel that. You want people to feel bad, but I promise you, someone feeling guilty and bad, that's just more emotional energy we got to process before we can get to the solutions. I don't care about you feeling bad. I want you to acknowledge it was horrible. Let's look at Emmett Till and cry together for a fellow American, not for my people, our people that have been lynched, and then let's do better so our people, Americans, don't get lynched. Or don't get disregarded, don't get shafted with so many inequitable processes and systems. So I don't want to break the system. I want to break the elements of the system that are racist. I do believe personally, some people may disagree, I believe the Constitution, I believe our systems of human rights in this country are some of the best this whole world has ever seen. They are tainted and they are tinted with blackness and understandings of race and racialization that are problematic. But if we tear the whole thing down and burn the whole thing down, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice. So I first tell people I don't want to tear it down. I love it. I want to tweak it. I want to adjust it. I want to rebuild.
This connects immediately to some other questions we've gotten about critics of, especially, a recent push to teach more honestly about slavery and the legacy of systemic racism in our classrooms by labeling that un-American. And what you've just described to us is that there is nothing incompatible about grappling with this history and loving your country. And that, in fact, facing down this history in an honest way and demanding something better can be a way of demonstrating that love of country and that desire for something better.
I'm gonna go ahead and snap that out, Joanne. Yes, I could not have said it better. Exactly. Why don't we want better for ourselves? In the talk, I say, are we allowed to want better for our children, to do better for them, our children, right? And I think that's what we should want. It's not good enough, and that's part of the American spirit. I say this lust for liberty. It is insatiable. It is infectious. It is indomitable. It should never be good enough. We should be pressing into better for and with each other. If we're contented, then I think we're in a dangerous place.
Hearing you strategize about how to communicate, how to build relationships, even with folks who would deny the very existence of systemic racism, I think it leads naturally into some questions about public performance and about the power of art in bridging that gap. So you talked about Emmett Till's mother and her bravery and framed that as activism. And I think really one of the main things you've gotten us thinking about tonight is the different forms that activism can take. It is not just about holding signs and marching. And so one question we got in from Shayna Andrews from ECU is, as a writer and emerging educator, what role do you believe creative leaders have to play in this? How can artists impact people beyond the classroom?
Oh, wow. Just look at the influence that artists have in our society today, especially among young people. And think about all the movements that have been fueled by passionate, sometimes ignorant youth, right? They don't even know they can die. They just run right into the forge, so to speak. And so music, art, theater, visual art, all of that is so powerful. It taps into, I think, our higher being, our higher sense of self. It transcends, right, skin color and biology, and it actually gets us to a place where we can imagine what if. That's the power to me of performance. Is like we get to imagine what if in a way that's not dangerous. Like I can tell you, I would like to consider this possibility, and it's on a stage. So it's not like I've changed your reality. I'm just saying let's consider it. Let's play with it. I've painted this picture. This I love Afrofuturism, for example, kind of imagining. You look at the Black Panther, imagining an African country that was not colonized, because all of them that I know of were colonized at some point, right? So imagine one that's not colonized, where people have their dignity and it's never been broken down, and white superiority or supremacy has never been placed upon them. Those kind of things. So I think that the arts are a very, very important and fertile place to start having these conversations. We don't always end it in the arts, but sometimes we do. I mean, you look at some of the great musicians of our times, whether it's Bob Marley or Nina Simone. There's so many people who've just stood up, Bob Dylan, who stood up and they put into their lyrics and into their activism and their fundraising, etc., actual change toward equity. And some of those songs that they sang were, we were listening at the beautiful music leading in. Some of the songs that have been sung have become the anthem for change and empowered us and strengthened us, right? So I think that's so important. And I will say, I was pleasantly surprised by the work that I do now. I was just trying to finish my PhD and just do some work. Joanna, you were there with me. We were both working hard. And I was just trying to figure stuff out. And in doing the talk, it was initially kind of therapy. Then it became a kind of a critical analysis of race in America. Then it became a performative piece. Now it's become a form of activism because I'm literally having conversations with people who don't look like me that I never would have had if the art hadn't opened it up. Now all of a sudden we've cried together and we've laughed together and we shared some moments. We didn't always agree, but like that was good. That was really thoughtful both guys. I liked how you use that alliteration, that little rhyme. Was that your poem? Okay, right? Or I'll act out, the words of Frederick Douglass, which are just timeless, right? And we all have to agree that was beautiful. That was sublime. And not because I'm a talented person, but the arts tap into our desire to touch the divine, that which is sublime, that which is above the messiness of humanity. We got to deal with the messiness of humanity, but we're inspired by the arts. The arts drive us forward and push us into it and revive us, right? Give us a greater capacity to deal with one another when we can find joy in laughter and in nuance and in color and paint, all these different things. So I think the arts are important. And I always like to quote from the show Rent. My favorite line is, the opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. And I think creation is where the artist lives. The artist's home is creation, always producing things, not for money, but producing things for consumption to give healing and health and strength to the population.
Yeah, the language that you're using around art, of healing, of sacredness, it's opening up new potentialities.
I have to give a shout out. I'm reading a book now by Resmaa Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands. Beautiful piece about basically how in our bodies we hold the tension of violence and racism. All of us do, all of us. We all feel the tension. You see a black man being injured. You see a white man being, whatever it is, we racialize it and we feel this tension. And his idea is that you don't try to explain it away or run away from it or pretend it wasn't there. Just sit in it and notice the tension and acknowledge it. And I think the beauty of a performer's mind and body is that I'm trained to use this vessel to feel those tensions and navigate them. I'm not afraid of them because I know that all of that is in me. There are villainous things that I've done in my life and villainous thoughts that I've had. Thank God I haven't done most of the things I thought to do, right? But there are things in me. I can play a villain, I can play a good guy, but it's all in me. So I've learned to kind of let that tension move through my body. And he has this term he uses. It's called somatic abolition. This notion of kind of abolition of slavery, right? But we're all enslaved, white, black, and all of our different backgrounds. We're enslaved by the genomic kind of damage that's occurred to our ancestors, and in some cases to us directly. And it does get paid. If you look at epigenetics, that trauma, it does transfer down to generations, whether it's racialized trauma or just trauma, right? It's all trauma. And so that's why I stress, for example, in early American history, it was insanely violent, like lynching and all this kind of stuff. It's been racialized now, but Americans have not been kind to each other or other people around them. We've been insanely violent people. We're getting better, but we've got some issues. And so we oftentimes start at 1619 and slavery, but it's like, no, white folks have been killing white folks. Black folks have been killing black folks. Native Americans have been killing Native Americans. And we've done some of the cruelest things to ourselves, right? And that's not to take the onus off of any one group, but it's to say that nobody's hands are clean and we all have this generational trauma and we present with it. And what we need to do is we need to acknowledge it. When we feel it tense us up, we need to work through it. And like I like to say, play with it, play through it, turn it into poetry, turn it into movement. Maybe we turn it into dance, maybe we put it into a play. And now all of a sudden it's in this place where I can deal with it, I can analyze it, I can see it. It's still a part of me. It's always going to be there, but because now I've turned it into this place of play, I don't have to be overcome by guilt or shame or confusion. I can start to really get a deeper understanding of it and turn it into my flow. Okay, I just got a new swagger now, and I'm not going hip hop on you. I'm just going my own. This is how I do it. I just turn it into a movement. So when I perform, I'm taking all these stories, the sorrow of Emmett Till's story, and the dignity of Mamie Till. I'm taking in Manly Macaulay and his untimely death at 18 just for running away with a girl. I mean, goodness gracious, all these things. And I'm just letting them flow through my body so I can deal with them. And I lead by example. So I'm putting my skin in the game, and I'm kind of offering my body as a performative vessel to show people, y'all, the water's fine. It gets kind of dicey at times. It's tough, but it's okay. Get in here because this is how we grow. but we can't, us staying on either side of the pool, and this is a good analogy, right? You know, you hear about these pools that were emptied during the time of integration, right, or desegregation. People would just prefer not to swim rather than to swim with colored people. Wow, so we all lose? No, get in the water and deal. That was just kind of out of nowhere. I hope I didn't go off on too far of a tangent.
No, that is wonderful. You know, bringing up this idea of generational trauma. It just feels like such an important theme, especially for educators to be grappling with. So many of the audience members with us tonight are working either with children or with teenagers or with young adults who are themselves grappling with that trauma. And so what would your general recommendations or advice be to teachers who are trying to introduce difficult, painful topics such as lynching to their students?
You know, I'm all about finding common ground. We can't always find common ground. Believe me, I know I am a reckless optimist. I admit that. I am a reckless optimist. I will love on anybody. You come at, but I know there are some who are incorrigible, but that's a very few. Most people, when you love on them and encourage them and you listen to their story, if you seek first to understand, you'll find them open up to you and you'll find new segues and you'll learn yourself, but you'll stretch them and adjust. So what I like to do is always, as a teacher and a leader, is I lead with vulnerability. So this year, for example, my father passed away from COVID-19. I don't say that for pity. I just want to make it clear. My father was a great teacher. So I'm driven oftentimes because I know I'm carrying on his legacy. When he passed away in January, I was still teaching classes at Fayetteville Technical Community College. I did not hold that back from my students because I wanted to pretend like I had it all together and I was a professor. Students need to know it's okay to be imperfect. It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to deal. So I would at times, those first few lectures, I would break into tears and I would just kind of tell students, hey, I'm holding my dad's mug here. You know, I still got his mug. He's a big Dodgers fan. He'll hold my dad's mug and I drink out of it and I keep it close to me. And the students, as I cried and taught and tried to work my way through, they became my strength because they loved on me and encouraged me and said, oh, it's okay, Dr. Kelly, it's okay, we're right here with you. And they were given permission to hurt and to not be okay and to still be committed to learning and growing. So I'm leading by example in that sense. So I think it's important for teachers to admit, you know, I don't know about that. I want to learn more. Oh, that really hurt my feelings. Or that hurt me too. When I hear this story, it always hurts me so much because I had this experience as well. Not to try to find exact parody or analogy, right? I don't think that indentured servitude is the same thing as chattel slavery. No, but there's a connection there. And if we lose sight of that connection, that the powers that be were trying to divide and conquer people and trying to get free labor or cheap labor out of poor people who didn't have political power, then we lose the opportunity to be better together and stronger. So I think it's important. Like, for example, one of my students taught me this at UNC Chapel Hill, Catherine Brown. Amazing. She's a published author now. Excellent writer. Anyway, so she did this thing. I had them all perform their family history, and she is a white woman from the South, and she made biscuits for the class, and she pretended she had this long table spread out of all of her family members. She asked her mom. She said, "Who's that guy down at the end?" And her mom, she's playing her mom because we're doing one person shows. Her mom says, "Oh, that's your great grandfather. He was a Confederate officer, and he was all by himself." And she had this moment where she humanized him for me. He was still human, right? Totally disagree with everything he stood for, but I mean, he's still part of her family. That's still her peepaw, or whatever the case may be, right? And then she said, and she got really sad about that, like, I'm really ashamed of that, which, you know, yeah, that's not a very honorable thing to do. I'm not saying we blow it off. But then she talked to her mom and said, Mom, how do we reconcile this? How do we deal with this? And her mom said, I want you to look through our family records. See that name right there, Freeman? Somebody in our family was named Freeman. That means at one time he was a servant, and he became a free man, and he changed his name. So we have something in common. We don't know the same exact, but that moment when she reached out, and she wasn't being petty, and she wasn't trying to blow it off like, oh, slavery wasn't that bad. She was just trying to find a connection between my people and her people. I was like, thank you. Black folks will tell you this. When you're at a black church and a white person walks in, we're like, oh, hey, y'all, okay. We love it. We love it when you come to our community because we're always outnumbered. But white folks are rarely ever intentionally outnumbered. So when you are a white person or a person who's not black or a person who's not from the background of the history you're teaching, because we have many different histories to teach, Pacific Island, Asian, there are so many different histories that we don't talk about, right? It's just a matter of being humble, talking about your own concerns, your own insecurities, how you have some more you want to learn, asking the students to teach you, having the students do research and teaching you stuff, like the Freeman thing. I learned that from her. I was like, oh, that's a good point. Okay. And so being open in the Paulo Freirean sense to be a teacher learner, right? But also to be vulnerable and say, I'm the first one to tell you all I'm ignorant. And guess what? Ignorance is a great thing because it is an opportunity. I don't punish ignorance in this class. I will check willful ignorance, and I will check bad behavior that is disrespectful and that is not gracious or loving or kind. But if you are ignorant and you just don't know, that's an opportunity. Somebody, let's all share. Let's figure out how we can help this person. And I'm going to come to y'all ignorant every day because I don't know everything, even with my little PhD. Come teach me, please. And when you do that, the students open up. They feel the sense of agency. They want to share. They'll do research with you, and you'll learn. And now it's no longer about my talking points, my agenda. I want to teach the 1776 agenda. I want to teach the 1619 agenda. How about you teach both? Because they're both real years that happen in the real country and the real world here today. Thanks, Pop.
So again, going back to what you started out our Q&A discussion with, vulnerability, finding places to connect,
Yeah.
and modeling that kind of openness in the classroom in a way that will encourage students, hopefully, to carry that kind of mindset, not just through their studies, but in their day-to-day lives, in conversations with friends and family and strangers.
That's well said. I got to give a shout out. My mom, Joe Kelly's on there. She says, "Where do you get your drive and information?" I get my drive from you, Ma, and Pop, and the desire to share love and kindness. My father was an educator. My mother's always an in-home daycare provider and a foster mom, etc. And I saw my parents reaching out and loving on people. And I found that as a performer, since this is kind of what I do, I'm able to reach out and love on people as a teacher and a performer in this unique way that not everybody else can do. And in terms of the information, and somebody mentioned to me, how did I get the idea for Haunted? It was Morgan. Thank you for that. Once I start studying one thing, I dig deeper, and I dig deeper, and I realize, oh, there's this complicated network of roots down here that are informing the routes that we're taking. We should probably study that stuff, kind of a Foucauldian genealogy, but just not that complicated. Foucault could go hard. I'm like, what are you talking about, bro? But I love his concept of constantly critically just assessing and evaluating yourself and your reality and why do we get here? How do we get here? Don't take it for granted, And so Haunted for me was me digging deeper, and then people like Christy helping me out to kind of just see like how Crispus Attucks fit into this. We were just kind of playing with this. We did a session for the K-12 folks, the Carolina K-12 folks on Crispus Attucks a few months back. And as I dug into that, I realized, oh, there's more to it. There's more before him and after him. So I just kind of realized American history is highly under nuanced, understudied. I think we should add all of those. We shouldn't just choose one perspective, add all the different perspectives so we can get a better idea of what we're dealing with. And so Haunted for me is just my dig into the research. But at one point I had to stop because it was just so much. I was like, whoa, tap out. I mean, when I found out there was a black senator in 1870 named Hiram Revels who came from Fayetteville, North Carolina, I was like, why didn't nobody ever tell me this? We had black senators in the 1870s, right? But then Reconstruction ended, Jim Crow rose up, and it would be another over 80 years before a black face would come to the Senate floor. So when you see a black senator today, like Kamala Harris or like Tim Scott or the blacks, like that's a rare and amazing thing that has happened in our country. For over 80 years, there was one, and there were two actually. There was Hiram Revels, there was Blanche K. Bruce. Blanche K. Bruce was a former slave, by the way. They were both senators for Mississippi. Blanche K. Bruce left office in 1881, and then from there to 1967, not a black face in the Senate. That's tremendous. Talk about no taxation without representation. And people wonder why you're mad.
You've already started answering this question. But in your research, Claire DeRoche asks, she's an educator who's working with the Unitarian Universalist congregation at Shelter Rocks, whether there are any other unsung heroes of the civil rights movement or under-recognized figures in Black American history that we should all know about, or who stood out to you in your research.
So I just named Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, and I think it's important that to notice that when you find a black person doing great things, especially in the 18th, in the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, just realize they were multitasking because they were like a few of them, and they were trying to find a way to do this while they were being captive, right? Trying to work through the power. So they were code switching. Y'all think you can code switch now? Oh, they were, right? So you take a person like Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman did reconnaissance for the soldiers in the Civil War. So there were 180,000 black men who fought for the Union Army in the Civil War. We don't know the countless women and even children who fought and didn't get the respect at the time because of their gender or age, right? But Harriet Tubman actually did reconnaissance. That's something I want to dig research and do more research into, but I just learned about that. I also know that Hiram Revels, for example, who was the first black senator, he was also building schools, he was teaching, he was a politician, he'd gone to Ohio, to North Carolina, he was moving around trying to start new schools for new opportunities for black people. people. And he also was a chaplain in the Union Army. And he helped to muster black troops to fight for their freedom, literally, in the Union Army. I mean, so you start off with, oh, a black senator, cool. But right? And then start just checking off to see the people he hung out with and see how that connects and those kind of things. So, that's one area that I definitely would look at is looking at just the people who blip up on the screen. If they blip up, there's probably a reason, right? They were probably doing there's obviously a reason, but they were doing multiple things that nobody ever even talks about. Ida B. Wells, right? Ida B. Wells, to be honest, I knew the name. We mentioned her name in Black History Month. She was a great journalist, anti-lynching activist. You know that concept, but when you look at her work and realize that she was like literally persecuted, like McCarthyian level persecuted, it's amazing that she lived and was not killed or hurt or maimed. People around her were killed and lynched, and she spoke up strong as a woman in America who was black and a woman living at that intersection, right? So Ida B. Wells, there's so much to be said about her life and her influence and her boldness and courage. Don't let me get going on Fannie Lou Hamer. That's a name that some people know, some people don't know. But Fannie Lou Hamer was an amazing woman who stood up to the Southern Democrats, stood up to the face of Jim Crow in the 60s, and stood up as a civil rights leader who I don't even think she might have had a high school education, but amazing leader. And then of course we have in Durham, what's my sister's name, who was a spiritual leader, and
Polly Murray.
Polly Murray, come on, Polly, come on. Polly Murray, who was an amazing human being and spiritual leader, political leader, writer, poet. Come on. So again, you got these multitaskers. You find one, you find a cornucopia of opportunities, and then you start looking at who they hung out with and who they spoke with, and find those connections as well. And I think and I'm speaking from a black perspective, but let's open this up. I mean, how many centuries now have we had Asian people, South Asian people, and of course Native American, Indigenous, First Nations people doing great things in this country? One thing that I'm very proud of, and I didn't learn until about maybe the last 5 years of my father's life, was that my name Sonny is partially after a guy named Sonny Sixkiller, who was a starting quarterback for University of Washington back in the 60s. He was a smaller Native American guy who played quarterback. My dad loved his grit, thought he was a tough guy, and that's part of the reason why he named me Sonny. So that lives in me as well, and those are the kind of stories that give me a connection to a community that I don't always visibly identify with.
Mm. Amazing. Thank you so much for not just sharing those names, but also, just encouraging us to not just seek out these individuals, but to try to grasp the breadth of what they were doing, the breadth of the different forms that their activism took.
Yeah, I love it. Exactly.
Now, I know that we are running up against time here, but I have just a few more questions that I would love to get through here with you. So we did get a bunch of specific questions about resources, and just so everyone knows, we will be sharing a list of resources in a few days along with the recording of this event. But just off the top of your head, are there any books, documentaries, podcasts, just anything you would recommend to audience members who are looking to learn more about the long civil rights movement?
Yeah, there's so much good stuff out there. I'm looking at so I was commissioned to do Haunted by the Orange County Coalition, the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition. I always got to make sure I lock that in. And they hit me to a source that helped me to look up lynching and lynching in America that's connected to EJI. So I would say if you go to the Equal Justice Institute or Equal Justice Initiative, headed by Brian Stevenson, you will find information about lynching, about anti-lynching, about the civil rights movement there, some stories that you've never heard before. And some of the stuff that I was able to pick up today, I got from looking at that, but also there's a database called the Red List?
The Red Record?
The Red Record, thank you. The Red Record. I've dug in it so much, it's on my favorites. I don't have to type it anymore. The Red Record, you can actually look up lynchings that have happened, and what you'll find is connected to those lynchings, that oftentimes they are connected to people who were civil rights leaders, but then you'll see what people did about those lynchings to try to find justice, etc. And so the Red Record was a very helpful place for me. I think that just having watched some of the films that have been put out recently, the documentaries that have been put out, whether it's When They See Us, Ava DuVernay, or the 13th. 13th was tremendous. If you haven't seen 13th, I mean, please just see 13th. It's sit down and watch 13th. My family and I are now on Netflix. We're watching Amend, which is a mini series that is hosted by Will Smith. and it's got a host of actors and actresses that come in and bring the voices of historians that kind of take us through what the 14th Amendment means, right? It's supposed to give citizenship and protection of life and liberty and property to all human beings in the country, but it's been a long process of demanding the promises of the 14th Amendment, stuff I never even knew about. So great documentary to watch. And in terms of reading, I've enjoyed Ibram X. Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. I take it, there's some political things that he mentions in there that I'm like, I don't know if I totally agree with everything he says. But for the most part, I think it's a solid piece. But especially the history, stamped from the beginning, is his first big book, and that's a great genealogy into how blackness came to be what it is today. Right, this thing is a threat, but it's also a marker for violence. It's also a marker for for kind of the animality of things. How do we get here? It didn't just come out of nowhere. It's not like in my opinion, it's not like white people are just innately racist and they woke up when they said, "Oh, black people." No, there are a whole lot of things that happen economically, politically, spiritually, etc., that have caused this current state of affairs and current picture of what blackness is. So I think for me, it's been watching a lot of the film, and then I watched Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story. That I think it's on Amazon Prime. That's an amazing story about what is a modern day lynching. There's no other way to put it. George Zimmerman lynched Trayvon Martin, in my opinion. And then there's also another one called Time. It is Time. It is the Ahmad. Not the Ahmad Arbery. The Khalif Browder story. And if anybody who's seen The Talk, that I go deep into the Khalif Browder story, because that is a huge travesty of justice. And I was inspired when I watched that. They were, I think Time, the Khalif Browder story, and Rest in Power, the Trayvon Martin story, were both at least sponsored. If they're either co-produced or produced by the rapper Jay-Z, Sean Carter. Side note. So another example of an artist, right, doing great work. And I'll just be frank with you. I'm much more of a conservative person socially. I'm not a big fan of Jay-Z's music, especially not the traditional like misogyny, alcohol. I'm like, yeah, I'm a youth pastor, not gonna rock that. But I'm looking at what this guy's doing as an artist in other realms, in other, like the breadth of the work, as you said, Joanna. The breadth of the work is amazing. So don't just toss people out. Take a look and see all the stuff they're doing. Black people in America especially, but black people even more so, because we've had to be, are so innovative and so rich and so courageous. We take big choices and make big moves. So you'll just look at. I think those are some great places to start.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, we will go through and list out those resources to share with everyone who registered for today. But there's one other huge resource that we want to point folks towards, which is your plays. So can you tell our audience members how they can watch The Talk and Haunted?
Yes. So, like I said, it's commissioned by the Orange County Community Remembrance Coalition, and it is produced by Orange County Arts Council, and it will be performed live at the Art Center in Carrboro. But don't try to come physically to the Art Center. It will just be like our production team, and we're socially distanced, and thank God I don't have to wear a mask. I'd fall out on the stage. And so we're going to be doing it this Saturday at 2 p.m. If you go to my website, sonnykelly.com, or if you go to the Orange County Arts Council website, you will click on a link there. You can register, and you'll get reminders. You'll get on the mailing list so you can see how this work is doing and get involved with more of this work. Or you can just click on the link, and I think we have it. We're going to be doing it on YouTube Live as well as Facebook Live. So it's going to be free. This is free art to the public. So I am being that public scholar that I promised I would be before I got my PhD. So I'm really looking forward to just sharing this art with folks, and then I'm going to take a break and sit down and go back to teaching, because I love teaching most. And this has been definitely a labor of love, but it's a story that needs to be told. Manly Macaulay, we should know his name. We should know his name. We should know what happened to him, and make sure that no American, white, black, or any other background ever experiences the namelessness, the inhumanity that he experienced, or that the people of his like have experienced in this country.
Amen to that. All right. Well, as always, we could keep talking to you hours and hours, Sonny, but we will not keep you any longer. But thank you for giving us so much to reflect on this evening.
Truly my pleasure.
To pick up on a theme that you brought up here, you've not just given us a lot to think about, you've given us a lot to feel. And that's a remarkable gift that you have as a performer. And it's also just a remarkable power of art. So I think, if there were anyone here who doubted the value and the pedagogical power of the performing arts coming into this event, I'd like to talk to them. at the
I'll close with this. One of my greatest mentors, and one of the greatest things you can do is mentor somebody, because I mean, every one of us who's a superstar, we're just an amalgamation of all the people who've invested in us, right? But Renee Alexander Kraft, my advisor at UNC Chapel Hill and one of my great teachers of performance ethnography, she would always ask me after I would present any performative piece, "That's great, Sonny. Now what is it going to do in the world?" And I want to challenge you. Whatever you produce, whatever you put into the world, what is it going to do in the world? And if it's not doing something, figure it out and make it do something. Don't waste your time here.
That is such a good parting thought to leave us reflecting on. And we're gonna play ourselves out here with another piece of art. But before we do, I want to say a huge final thank you to the organizations that made tonight's event possible, to the ECU Ladonia Wright Cultural Center and to ECU Global Affairs, as well as to Nicole Ianieri, Christy Norris, and Paul Benici. And of course, a big thank you to Dr. Sunny Kelly for your insights, the histories you've traced, the pedagogy you've modeled, and for your lasting provocation that we think in a radically different way about both the past and about the future of the long civil rights movement. So we will all stick around here, Sunny, Christy, myself, Nicole, for a few minutes in the chat box as everyone filters out. But I'll now ask Paul Benici to play us out with the beautiful and timely song, "A Change Is Gonna Come" by the amazing Sam Cooke. And for those of you who were here for our last event on March 9th, you may remember getting a live performance of this song from Dr. Freddie Parker, but it certainly feels worth revisiting as we reflect on today's themes. So thank you all and enjoy the music.